Hello, good afternoon. My name is William Morisi, and the topic for this chapter, as proposed, is exploring the intersection of entrepreneurial place leadership and sociocultural institutions. We look at how entrepreneurial leaders navigate complex institutional context to create social value in Kenya. So this is focused on data collected on three case studies in Kenya. And I want to explore some of the ideas that this chapter will be exploring and potential contributions as well for this chapter. So, ideally, this work is proposing new approaches to studying entrepreneurial leadership within context, and this is contextualized to sub-Saharan Africa, and the data is drawn from Kenya, which is in the eastern part of Africa as well. So, give an overview of a bit of an introduction, then some of the literatures on the field and how that links to the research, then propose a theoretical framework that I intend to use for this chapter, the method to be used, as well as some of the potential discussions and contributions that would emerge from this piece of research. So, entrepreneurial leadership itself doesn't have, particularly doesn't have a, a definition as of yet, because it's the intersection between entrepreneurship as we know it, or entrepreneurs as we know them, and the field of leadership. So these two constructs were fused together to talk about entrepreneurial leadership. So this construct doesn't have clearly a definition in itself, but those who've looked into it draw the similarities between entrepreneurs and leaders, and have tried to construct these two constructs to create sort of like a conceptual overlap, which is now emerging to be entrepreneurial leadership in itself. And this then has gone to, the scholars have gone then to identify some of the characteristics that define entrepreneurial leaders or entrepreneurial leadership. And that has been the genesis of this topic, which is quite interesting, looking at different traits of leaders, personality traits, for instance, psychological traits, and also some of the behavioral characteristics that emerge that are quite similar between entrepreneurs and leaders in the community. So this creates a challenge, and as well as brings in a very interesting perspective as to leaders and entrepreneurs in this context and chapter, to see how this can be change makers within the community, where they are in terms of applying some sort of like traits or characteristics that they have to solve problems within the community, which can lead into creating value, or on a wider perspective, social economic development, especially for the context that this research is focused on. So in that regard, there is some weaknesses that have emerged, of course, and it's good to acknowledge some of these weaknesses within the entrepreneurial leadership research, and it's all about that specific. Are there any specific emergent sort of like characteristics or traits that are not really saying these are similar characteristics or common characteristics among them, but can we really define entrepreneurial leaders, especially within the context that this entrepreneurial behaviors are engaged. So the thing is, from previous literature, as I said before, they've talked about psychological approaches. They've talked about some of the contextual approaches that have been used to define sort of like entrepreneurial leadership. And uh, the current literature has tended towards a holistic approach that looks at both psychological and contextual sort of like characteristics that define entrepreneurial leaders, where, of course, to say behavior can be a determinant, for instance, for entrepreneurial climate or context, as much as determined by as well context. So the behavior of this entrepreneurial leaders can be defined by the entrepreneurial climate within a specific place or the context in itself. And in as such, then context becomes very significant in studying entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial leaders in the way they engage and how they transform there, or they transfer or transform the organizations they create to create value and also have an impact on the social economic value. So picking up on the research that has been there, so there is the aspect of context, why this is very critical and why context in itself plays a bigger role in understanding some of the contextualized characteristics that entrepreneurial from specific areas are able to bring out forth, and how they ensure that they use that ability of being entrepreneurial leaders to enable others to build organizations and to transform organizations and go ahead to create value. So contextual approach is in itself very, very inherent, especially when we recognize that research on entrepreneurship, as Walter 2011 talks about it, needs to be contextualized because this environment, for instance, the paper by we've written before, Maurizio et al. This paper talks about there being strong or coexistence of formal and informal institutional context in some of the sub-Saharan African countries. So it's not like a case of where previous institutional theories have talked about formal institutions being predominant. In this scenario, you see a lot of informal institutions, sociocultural kind of like institution culture, religion, and this kind of institutions being very predominant and have a big influence in terms of how entrepreneurship, leadership, political leadership in that sense takes place in this context. And this have an impact a lot in terms of development as well within these regions. So having said that, there is need for more African focused research to develop context-bound, context-specific, and context-free knowledge that is able to unpack the contextual influences that are predominant and have an impact on how these entrepreneurial leaders work. Uh, of course, it's been ages now, for a while known that previously Africa used to be known as a parochial dinosaur. People don't really understand what really research context is done, but there's a lot of findings and a lot of research and studies that have come out and said it's a very unique context that requires us to focus on it to be able to understand how it might influence theories that have been created before, or leading to new theories being formed. So the question we deal with, I deal with in this chapter, is how does entrepreneurial leaders navigate complex institutional context to create social value in Kenya? All right. So going forward, the chosen theoretical framework for this study or presenting this is transformational leadership, because it's my belief that entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial leaders are transformational agents that really bring change within the communities they work, and with the context that is being applied here, they're very, very critical in terms of also on a wider scale of socioeconomic development. So leadership itself is capable of sustaining innovation and adoption in high velocity and uncertain environments such as what the context is here, Sub-Saharan Africa, and entrepreneurial leadership in itself, in the understanding of this context, is defined in part by the ability to evoke extraordinary effort among entrepreneurial leaders and in others as well, which in turn is found in the context the farm or entrepreneur need to adapt to emerging environmental contingencies. So these areas with a lot of uncertainty, my belief is this will be the rightful framework to be able to unpack this construct. So I would adopt the case study approach, which is informed by the previous research method, and this will be the anchorage in terms of studying these three cases, data from these three cases, and also additional anecdotal data that will be used to unpack the construct in this chapter. So we build, and I build on the work of Vashinina 2018, Murithi 2019, Zuga as well, and Welter in this chapter. Be able to unpack the effects of the sociocultural institutional context and drawing from especially the cultural toolkit developed by Vashinina and et al. 2018, which is very informative and talks about how national culture within a context can influence entrepreneurial venture creations in that sense. So in this chapter, I'll propose that these socially minded entrepreneurs can tell stories, of course, which sound, for instance, to be would-be entrepreneurs, but which at the same time smuggle a new message into people's mind, and that's where the transformational leadership comes in. So some of the contribution is to have a nuanced understanding of how institutional context, informal spaces, in that sense, enable transformational entrepreneurial leadership place or style to take place. Holistic characteristics as well in terms of entrepreneurial leadership for Kenyan technology entrepreneurs, as well as extending this to sub-Saharan Africa as well, and have socially responsible innovation and actions as well among entrepreneurs, trying to identify how they do that to create social value. And finally, my intention is to create a model for researching the intersection between entrepreneurial leadership and sociocultural institutions within developing economies as well as a big contribution for this chapter. Additionally, of course, propose some policies and practices in developing entrepreneurial leadership within developing economies. Right, so that's an overview of the focus for this chapter. And thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or have any suggestions, you can email me on Marithi William at gmail.com. So it's my surname, William at gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening and all the best in the afternoon session.